Going. Okay. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Popular Music Books in Process, which is a joint project of the Pop Conference, IASPM US, and the Journal of Popular Music Studies. I'm Francesca Royster from DePaul University, and we want to just thank you for coming on the behalf of my co-organizers, Carl Wilson, Gus Stadler, Eric Weisbard, and Kimberly Mack. So you can find our whole calendar of events on the IASPM website under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab. And you can also get on the mailing list by contacting Eric. And also that's where you can catch up on the videos of our past sessions, including our wonderful past events and what's coming up soon. Soon will be Kimberly Mack will be talking about her new 33 and a half book, 33 and a third book, Time's Up, and she's going to be presenting on May 15th. But today we're so excited to have Alex DeLacy, Justin Williams, and Razor with us to talk about grime music. Grime music has been central to British youth culture since the beginning of the 21st century. Performed by MCs and DJs, it is an Afrodiasporic form that developed on street corners, on pirate radio, and at raves. An emergent body of academic and popular literature has concentrated on the music's socio-political contexts. However, there has to date been no extended study of the form's performance techniques and values. So this panel discussion will focus on the new book, Level Up, Live Performance and Creative Process in Grime Music. DeLacy's volume, which offers the first long-form ethnographic study of grime practice. It questions how and why artists do what they do, and it asks what they can do, what they can tell us about creative process and improvisation more widely. The panel discussion will introduce the book before opening up into a conversation between the author, Grime MC Razor, and Ashgate Popular and Folk Music Series editor, Dr. Justin Williams. This discussion will unpack the purpose behind the book, draw upon chapters that speak directly to the creative work of London grime collective Over the Edge, and offer space for Q&A with attendees about the themes of the book and grime music more broadly. The book is now out through Routledge's Ashgate Popular Folk and Music series, which is edited by Lori Burns and Justin Williams. So I'll tell you a little bit about our participants. Dr. Alex DeLacy is assistant professor in popular music at the University of Groningen, Netherlands. His research focuses on performance in grime, hip hop, and jazz. His first book, entitled Level Up, Live Performance and Creative Process in Grime Music, is now out. And Alex also writes for Red Bull, Passion of the Weiss, and Songlines, and is published in Global Hip Hop Studies, Radio Journal, Popular Music, and Popular Music History. He also DJs for the grime crew Over the Edge with a monthly show on Mode FM. And Razor is an artist, presenter, and content creator from Hackney, East London. When he's not making music, he's presenting on Represent Radio or producing podcasts and videos. Often hailed for his sharp wordplay and outside-of-the-box instrumental selection, the sharp one is rarely what anyone expects from a grime MC. His music has been played on BBC Radio 1, BBC Radio 1 Extra, and KISS FM, and he's performed at an array of international festivals, including Outlook in Croatia. He's the founder of Grime Collective Over the Edge. And Dr. Justin Williams is a senior lecturer in music at the University of Bristol, the author of Rhymin' and Stealin', Musical Borrowing in Hip Hop, and Brit Hop, The Politics of UK Rap and the New Century from 2020. He is also the editor of the Cambridge Companion to Hip Hop and the co-editor with Catherine Williams of the Cambridge Companion for the Singer-Songwriter and the Singer-Songwriter Handbook. So as I turn things over to our wonderful panelists for this excellent presentation, I ask everyone to put their questions and comments in the chat. And for our panelists, you don't have to worry about answering the questions. We're gonna stop, in about 30 or 40 minutes and turn to our Q&A. I'll be moderating the chat, and I can help you see them so you don't have to be distracted by them. And so I'm now going to mute myself and turn off my video. I'm so excited for this great presentation.
Thank you so much, Francesca, for your really generous introduction. Well, I think we're all really happy to be here and looking forward to spending the next hour or so discussing grime music and all of the kind of intense in relation to its performance. So yeah, I'm Alex de Lacey. I'm really fortunate enough to be here alongside Dr. Justin Williams and Razor. And I thought I'm going to share a few slides at the outset to kind of speak a bit about the ideas and intentions behind the book. I'm going to give a bit of a primer on what grime is. I appreciate we're sort of delivering this in the United States, so to speak. So in terms of different understandings of the form, I thought it'd be good to kind of contextualize it really briefly, and then we'll open up into a discussion. Following that, with time for questions at the end. So let me just share my screen, and hopefully everyone can see this. Can we all see this? Perfect. So I'll start from the beginning and move through it. So on the screen here at the moment, you can see obviously the title, our names, but also you can see a sort of the front cover of the book, which is here, and two pictures, sort of early pictures from our days making music in East London when we were starting to formulate our practice in the mid 2010s. So the idea behind this book, as Francesca already said, was to kind of put together and unpack what grime artists do and when they're performing and why it's of interest musically. So my kind of motivation for this book stemmed back to lots of early journalistic writing about the form, kind of sensationalizing it and exoticizing it and saying it's just basically this musical form which is just really loud and has no kind of purpose and is just really cacophonous, rather than seeing it for its really sophisticated musical backdrop and kind of process. And so my background is like a performer and writer. Like I was a jazz pianist growing up and a guitarist, but I was also listening to pirate radio at night, and that's how I started listening to grime music. So I was really interested in improvisation and how I sort of saw that what was happening in grime was much more improvisationally complex than a lot of other forms, but he wasn't really given the credit for that. So that was kind of the idea for me doing this project, was to think about, well, what happens when artists take to the stage? How do they infer change musically? And through understanding this particular form, how can we find out more about other genres as well? So it brings together about six or 7 years of worth of work as a DJ in London. It's very much in conversation with other artists as well. So it features interviews with over 30 MCs, DJs, photographers, journalists, people who are kind of important to keeping the genre alive. And it works progressively through sort of 6 chapters that kind of attend to the key components of the form's live performance and also its ethical structure, the sort of do's and don'ts of the form, and why you should do that, why you shouldn't do that, and how that's kind of internally policed, although I don't want to use the word police, but kind of internally maintained by performers through this form. And there was a very nice quote in the Routledge Review saying this book would do for grime scholarship what Joe Schlosser's work had done for hip hop. And I thought that was quite nice, so I included that. And hopefully that might be partway agreeable for some of you after reading it. As this is a session on popular music books in process, I appreciate that people present these books at various points in their kind of journey. Some things could be things very much at the outset. And when I got in contact with the team to kind of do this sort of talk, I wasn't sure what stage it would be at. but it came out 3 weeks ago, and here is kind of an overview of how the book works in terms of chapters. So there's a brief introduction, and then it more goes into like real sort of history of grime music, its outset, how it's very much embedded within Black creative practice in the United Kingdom, before going into its early foundations as a musical form, how it kind of came to be, how these notions of what you should and shouldn't do are sustained, before then taking more of a magnifying glass to like very intense group processes within the form. So things that happen in performance that are really important, but everyone knows and everyone kind of understands and gets involved with. It then moves on to a more close ethnographic study of creative practice in London from about 2015 to 2020, and then finishes with a closer look at two particular collectives' creative work over a number of years and how that kind of work developed in situ in a really kind of active, lively performance environment. But I probably should tell you what Grime is, or kind of give you an indication of what this form is before, rather than sort of speaking in abstractions about the book. So Grime emerged in the United Kingdom at the turn of the millennium. It was practiced and still is practiced by MCs and DJs, and it has a musical history, as I mentioned, which is very particular to the United Kingdom, and very much relates to a number of forebearers from further afield. So to kind of get to grips with grime, you need to understand its role of Jamaican sound system culture, reggae, dancehall, hip hop, of course, and also more recent forms from the UK, such as hardcore, UK garage, and jungle. And some of its most famous proponents, for people who are watching this now or might be watching later on YouTube, are Wiley, Dizzy Rascal, and Stormzy. And here's a fairly iconic picture of Dizzy Rascal and Wiley from 2002, which is outside the Bow 3 Flats in East London. So to kind of give you a flavour of its influences and its origins, I wanted to firstly mention a kind of foreground dancehall and reggae. We might get onto this. There are instances where grime might be seen as like a subgenre of hip hop, and this is something which comes up in conversation. But there's very much a basis within dancehall, reggae, these kind of performance practices. And I found this out. Well, I kind of knew this intuitively, but spoke to people about this a lot when putting ideas together for the book. And so, in an interview with Suavo, who's a grime MC from West London, he said that when I was young, I was constantly listening to music. My parents are from Jamaica. I come from listening to reggae. I was just going along, spitting with yardy people, making up my own stuff for a joke. And here's another quotation from Rico Dan, who's an MC from East London collective Roll Deep, speaking about how his parents used to go to a lot of dances, and this was the music was played at home, and this influenced his practice. So speaking about Bounty Killer, Capleton, these sort of figures. And within grime as well, there's deep familial links to sound system culture as well. Two of its most sort of famous performers have strong links to this practice. So Spiro's father, Nereus Joseph, is a singer, and Footsie's father ran a sound system as well. And I just put a picture up here of an infamous clash between Vibes Cartel and Mavado in Sting in 2008. And Sting is kind of cited as a really formative event or inspiration for clashing culture within grime, which is also really important on top of the kind of more nuts and bolts of performance. So I should also mention hip hop as well. So grime is the point at which it emerged in the early 2000s kind of correlated with a lot of interesting stuff that was happening in hip hop as well at the time. So this sort of rise of, not the rise of the South, but the rise of sort of dirty South practice and crunk, these kind of things were really important and happening at that moment. And there's a really nice interview. Well, I say it's nice. It's an interesting interview between Dizzy Rascal and Peter Rosenberg, who Hot 97, who it's quite an interesting conversation. But within that, they speak to the influence of Southern hip hop on production in grime. So Dizzy Rascal speaks about the influence of 3 6 Mafia and Project Pat. He also mentions Timbaland and the Neptunes as well. And interestingly, grime kind of, it doesn't have a specific beats per minute, but it kind of goes between 135 and sort of 150. but there are a number of tracks around that time, the sort of double time feel that Timbaland was doing, that have a lot of commonalities with grime, and actually a lot of those tracks could be seamlessly used in grime sets. So if people are familiar with Ludacris's "What's Your Fantasy" is a tune that can just, but the instrumental of that track could basically be seen as a grime instrumental. So there's these sort of like really immediate influences from what was happening in hip hop at the time. There's long-standing influences from dancehall, reggae, and there's also influences from the more immediate club cultures in the UK throughout the 1990s into the early 2000s. As I mentioned, like hardcore, garage, and jungle. So in terms of a timeline for this form, it really kind of proliferated and solidified from 2002 to 2004. And if we think about it in terms of mapping sort of Black British creative practice, and we can turn to the sort of Titanic Paul Gilroy and his work on the Black Atlantic, speaking about how grime is a representation of wider Black Atlantic expression connected to the stereophonic, bilingual, or bifocal cultural practices across the globe. So although it's a performance tradition embedded in sort of particularly East London, but London more generally, it demonstrates links from figures like Count Suckle and Lloyd Coxon, through Janet Kay, to figures like Stevie Hyper D, Heartless Crew, So Solid Crew, Lisa Mafia, and then through to Dizzy Rascal. So to kind of sonically contextualize it as well, I thought I'd play a few short examples. The first of which is a really early instrumental track called Pulse X, which was kind of seen as a really pivotal turning point between garage and grime. And this has a kind of really fast-paced 8-bar structure where the track will switch up every 8 bars. But it's also quite fundamental in how it's made. So the idea is that from UK garage, which is very sort of like sung vocal led in some instances, but not in all instances, of course, you get grime just stripping back the production, which allows space for the MC to really thrive. So this is just an excerpt from Pulse X. That was a short excerpt of a track from Dizzy Rascal released on Boy in the Corner from 2003. And this record, alongside other records like Wiley's Treading on Thin Ice, were kind of really important moments for the form, which have been kind of bubbling and really building up in London throughout sort of late 2001 into 2002. But these were kind of like the first sort of substantial bodies of work that were released and seen as kind of important for signifying a change and establishing a genre. I'd also like to play just one more example before we get into the discussion. And this video kind of speaks to the group-led nature of grime as well. So you've just heard an instrumental, and then you've heard one of these key figures. But within grime, a lot of artists, particularly in the early days, were oriented around crews of MCs and DJs and working collectively. And this is a short excerpt from a track by Unorthodox, who are a trio from London, and this is No Lay on the sort of the first verse of this track. And the visual, characteristically quite sort of low quality, demonstrates what was happening. It's a really sort of exciting moment with lots of artists collaborating, working, innovating in the form. So this is just the first 45 seconds or so.
Unhappy. We can move where we want, no jurisdiction. Close up shift to where you're causing friction. And our spit what you call it addiction. We'll see what happens, might not get a billion. I wear old school high socks, flats and trillions. And our spit this on 1 in a million. From a friend that you said that you're feeling him. G killer docs, man, still be killing them. Man, I'm out squeak like you're sucking on helium. And I want big things close to pavilions. We two a royal family, we're bigger than Williams. I love all my people, they fucking civilians. Stuck in the community, lacking the unity. Immature youth, them grind through puberty. This is how it's meant to be a fading minority. Don't get up the youth, them where's your priorities? Been spitting for a while, I was the wild child. Never tread a mile, mature is my style.
Okay, so that was No Low from Unorthodox. And also you can kind of hear some of the kind of sort of political and very sort of social commentary interspersed within that track, which is really interesting. Is obviously a big part of the form. So maybe I can kind of skip through this quite quickly because Francesca's already introduced the panel. but for maybe those who've arrived late because of issues with the Zoom link, I'm really fortunate and blessed to be joined by my longtime collaborator, friend, Razor, who is an incredible artist, presenter, and content creator from Hackney in East London. He's waving. He's a host on Represent Radio, which is dubbed the Sound of Young London, which is a radio station broadcast on FM around London and also digitally. His music's been played everywhere, so BBC Radio 1, 1Extra, Kiss FM, has international festival bookings, and he also held it down inside the Tate Gallery. I think it was last week or the week before, DJing in front of a whole room of people and a very expensive painting. So incredible figure, founder of Grime Collective Over the Edge as well, who we're going to get onto. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Razor here today. From Over the Edge, who are the crew that I work with, and a lot of sort of the later pages of this book speak to and go into sort of the nuts and bolts of what it is to create on a daily basis with a collective of artists, and kind of works through that over a period of time. So just to contextualize that group, they kind of started in the 2010s. Razor is one of the main figures alongside Chowerman, who's an MC pictured there, Cabs, who is another MC from East London, Reeps, who's an incredible MC, myself, and also a producer, DJ, Index on decks. And the collective have had music mainly from Razor and Chowerman on Radio 1, 1Extra, global festival dates, and booked regularly across raves in the UK. So what this book also really tried to do is bring in a practitioner's perspective as well, which is something we might get onto. Sort of how do you see and understand a form from being sort of holistic, well, from being immersed within it and it being your kind of day-to-day experience rather than sort of looking at it from afar. And also I'm really blessed to be joined by Dr. Justin Williams, who's a senior lecturer in music at the University of Bristol, the author of an incredible amount of really interesting books, all of which I have read, editor of the Cambridge Companion to Hip Hop, co-editor of the Cambridge Companion Singer-Songwriter Handbook, also as the series editor of this series of books, which my book has come out within, and he's also got some really exciting stuff in the pipeline as well, which I'm not sure how much we can talk about, but it's very exciting. And then here's me as well. So I am a assistant professor in pop music at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. I've just arrived back from about a sort of 9-hour journey. So, but we're here. Had work published in a number of places, and I DJ with Over the Edge, with a monthly show on Mode FM. So that's kind of the introductions to Grime, to us. And I've asked Justin to kind of sort of chair the discussion and ask some questions, but also it can be quite open as well and kind of fairly freeform. But perhaps I can kind of stop my sharing of the screen and kind of turn to Justin and we can kind of go from there.
Great, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Alex and Razor. It's fantastic to have you here as well. And I think we'll do a few questions before we get sort of moderated by the wider chat people in the chat. So feel free to ask questions on that. I'd be remiss to say that happy UK bank holiday to all who celebrate. We had the day off today. It's a bit late, but it's great to be here. I'll hold up the book as well. I really do love this book. I'm a little bit biased, obviously, because it is in a series that Laurie and I co-edit, the Ashgate Popular and Folk Music series, which started by Derek Scott, and Stan Hawkins was doing it for a while, and now it's Laurie and me. So just a shameless plug to any people interested in writing for a popular music series. Our emails are always open with that. Another thing I really like about the book is its analysis of live music and its analysis of collaboration. So Alex, very much from the outset, says, okay, I can do my ethnography, I can write my field notes about my experience playing in this group, but I also appreciate the fact that my recollection of a particular incident isn't necessarily the same recollection as someone else. And so not only is he aware of recording collaboration as it happens, but is also really, really mindful to kind of get multiple perspectives. And I have to say that, I haven't seen anything that good, at least for hip hop, but for many other things. And as someone who likes to, sit at home with headphones analyzing recorded music, it's really refreshing to find these perspectives, especially when students come and say, well, how do you analyze a live show? How do you do these sorts of things? And I can point to them now with this. And really, the third sort of big thing I really like about this book is the balancing of practitioner and scholar and autoethnography, ethnography, and theory in a really balanced way. So, Alex, the first question I'm going to ask you is, how you balance your role as a practitioner and as theory. And it is clear from the book how you do that, and you're very open. But I want to give you a little bit of space to talk about that now, and then maybe we can ask you, Razor, as well. How does it feel working with a theorist, PhD now, academic plus DJ collaborator? But we'll start with Alex, and then maybe Razor, we can catch you on the flip side of it.
Nice one. Yeah, thank you, Justin. Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something I've kind of grappled with quite a lot. I think I kind of speak to it a lot in the first chapter of the book. It's like, I'm someone who I guess is within the academy, whatever that means in some regard, but also I fundamentally see myself as a performer and as a DJ. And that balance can be really hard, and particularly the balance can be hard in terms of like trying to kind of present the ideas of what's happening without either falling into a way in which you're kind of too specific to the form, so no one really knows what you're talking about unless there's someone who's seasoned in it and has been doing it for the past 10, 15 years, or also over theorizing and turning something into something that is not. So one of the things that I think is really important to the book, and one of the things that I argue for, is about kind of valuing, and it still seems silly we have to keep saying this, but kind of valuing what artists say about their work seriously, and valuing that a lot more than it sometimes is, and it very often is in a lot of cases. So rather than me kind of sort of theorizing from above onto this form, it's kind of like, well, let's see what artists are saying. How can these ideas really help us understand what's going on? And obviously, I'm situating it in relationship to existing theories and ideas and improvisation, because I've kind of got to acknowledge what has gone before. But also, there's some really great stuff that comes from artists, which is far more intuitive, far more interesting, and actually much better at explaining what's happening than some of the sort of like elaborate over theorizing that can happen. And one of the really good examples of that is a technique called the through ball, which is where artists will, the idea is using a through ball is like an artist will think about the projected position of their performer and kind of set them up to the point at which they've reached that. So it's taken from soccer or football for our kind of UK listeners, where someone will be running and a footballer or a soccer player will pass the ball to where that player is going to be. So it's about anticipating the projected movements of your fellow performer and using that as a really kind of like nice way of mapping what's happening. So it's a really, within it, it's a really complex process, lots of sort of intricate teasing from the DJ, lots of kind of rhythmic suggestions from the MC that things are about to change. But by taking something from like a sporting correlate, it really helps unpack what's actually going on without having to really elaborately explain it. And that can be really, really useful.
Brilliant. And yeah, Razor, can I throw it at you? Was it weird having someone, taking notes and, or was he doing it under the turntables, or, did you notice?
No, I think one of the things about Over the Edge, like comparative to some of the older Grime crews, is that we're all like sort of approaching our mid-late 20s now. So we were kind of birthed out of the wave of that sound and that culture that Alex was going through in the slides, where he was talking about the original sounds in 2002, 2004 kind of times. We were growing up, in parts of East London, Northwest London, where Rico, Dan and Suave are from, like respectively, kind of as younger people within the culture are observing that, and that almost gave us kind of like a self-aware. We were appreciators and commentators on and fans of grime and grime culture before we became creators or practitioners of grime music. So I feel like Alex's work and the work that eventually like went into the book felt quite natural for us as a group, because we, you know, we're very like sort of self-critical, but then we also look out into grime and we'll like have discussions and discourses about, okay, this is good. I think this is good. I think this is better than this. Why? What makes this better than this? What do I like about this? What vibe do I have from this? What about this performance has made this escalate and become the iconic bit that it is? So I feel like in that regard, yeah, we were probably, it felt really, really natural to have Alex doing that work alongside what we were doing. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's something about you know, hip hop as well, for example, that you know, the idea of the hip hop heads, you know, that whether you're in academia or not, or you're an MC or you're a fan, you know, there's a certain level of kind of engagement with ideas that I feel, again, maybe I'm biased, but it's just on a kind of higher level when everybody's a sort of fan and practitioner and things. Alex, if I could go back to you, another cool thing about this book is some of your comparisons with group improvisation, right? So you compare, I mean, yeah, I thought, yeah, you have a jazz piano background, as do I. And so probably helps you to see some of these things in different ways. But, you know, you were comparing what's going on the stage with lots of different types of sort of improvisation ensembles from different genres, which I thought was cool. So I guess to sort of flip that question on its head, you know, what can we learn about group improvisation from studying grime specifically?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and that's kind of one of the things that I wanted to do with this book, is to kind of speak to that and say, well, look what's going on here. And I think one of the things that grime does really well, which I hesitate to say like it's I think it's unique in a number of ways, but I hesitate to say this does this and nothing else does this, because of course there are moments in other forms where this kind of stuff does happen, but the kind of sheer, well, so sort of pare it back a bit. So there's this idea, this long-standing idea that antiphony and sort of call and response is really important to a number of forms like hip hop, right? So it's like someone will say, you say hip, we say hop, all this kind of stuff, right? The sort of call and response, crowd participation thing. And that is present in grime, obviously, but it also has this really kind of like multi-directional character where improvisational suggestions are happening at all times in a way that's kind of similar to jazz. But what's different is the fact that in say like in a quartet, for example, I think I've got Joe Henderson behind me. It wasn't intentional; I just saw it. So say you have a collective where there's kind of fairly distinct roles, right? So it's like you play the saxophone, you play piano, you play drums, you play bass, and within that, there are kind of roles that you play, supporting roles, and moments when you improvise. Within grime, you have a DJ, maybe two DJs, and sometimes you can have up to like 15 or 20 MCs. So the kind of collective marshalling of a performance like that is really quite remarkable. And within that, there is so many sort of slight adjustments which happen within it, which require such careful, attenuated listening for it to work properly. So it's always kind of balancing on the sort of edge of chaos, right? It's always at a point where the best moments are when it's almost falling apart, but it's being held together. And the kind of way that happens is just through this really sort of close listening and relationships that of sort of saying, okay, this MC is now going to sort of potentially fall in here, or they're repeating this particular thing. There's going to be a change. Do I jump on the mic? Do I wait? Do I kind of hold back? Okay, I like this track. I'm going to go in over this. And that kind of constant negotiation is really complex and involves so many actors and so many characters that kind of makes it distinct from other forms and really interesting to look at in how you could do that in a kind of collective setting where there's lots of people who ostensibly do the same thing but have to fit into a wider framework. It's kind of like when you're asked as when you're young people to like count to 10 as a group, but you have to sort of you can't say it at the same time as someone else, right? It's like working out where you fit within that wider patchwork is something that grime artists are generally really good at doing. When they're not, is you can tell, but generally they're really good at it.
And yeah, and it was amazing to hear some of the sort of anecdotes and stories of various the cues and not cues and things working and not, and I could really feel sort of what was going on from your descriptions. I also wanted to ask you, Alex, about if you wanted to say anything about your positionality as a white DJ in a Black British scene, and how that's been sort of navigated. Yeah, I'll just let you sort of, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, completely. And this is really important. So I will always be a guest in this scene and in this culture, because it's fundamentally a Black British form. And I think although I have understanding as a performer, right, and this is something which is useful and kind of matters and has kind of importance within the scene, I'll always be someone who is cognizant and deeply aware of the form's origins and where it comes from, and also my position within that. So I'm kind of telling one aspect of the story, but I can never tell the whole story. So I think that's really important. To set up front and always be mindful of, and sort of never sort of fully like claim this is my thing, right? This is something that I'm being welcomed into, and I love to pieces. Like this is like the honestly like trying to kind of map when I'm writing about this, like what it was like to be 12 or 13 when this was happening around you, and it's the most exciting thing ever. And you sort of listen to radio late at night and tape shows and all this kind of thing. But I was also, in terms of like geographically as well, I didn't grow up in London. I grew up about an hour south of London too. So there are certain aspects and certain characters of the form that like is something that I would never fully be someone who's fully like part of and embedded within, right? So there's always that kind of acknowledgement that needs to be made.
Oh, great. I'm gonna pop it back to from the DJ to the MC. And there's a really cool line, Alex, in the book, and I wrote it down, where you say MCs recite, react, create, and curate as part of a cognizant, complex, and situated engagement with their craft. And I just really like that. I wrote that down. But that's my sort of through ball there to Razor. Going back to this idea about knowledge. So it's a huge topic, and one that I'm increasingly trying to kind of pick at little by little, but from your vantage point, Razor, in terms of how you drop knowledge in sets, in freestyle, in teaching, take the question anywhere you want to take it, but in terms of the types of knowledge that you have that you want to sort of pass on to an audience or even students, how do you see knowledge flowing, maybe for you personally, but maybe also as the MC, as a representative of knowledge?
There's so many different ways that, like, I think knowledge comes into all forms of like sort of like musical expression and appreciation. And like the more knowledge and the more context that you have about things, the more, or a deeper or more significant or varied like form of appreciation you can unlock for that music. Even briefly going back to the question that you just asked, Alex, I feel like the way in which Alex's work has, and you touched upon it a little bit earlier on, the way in which his work is so focused on finding that balance between theorizing but also like listening and discussing. I think that has been one of the greatest forms of like sort of grime knowledge, like being passed on and like rotating and flowing through these like different exchanges between the different generations of artists and practitioners and people who are invested in the brand. And then also the fact that I guess that a lot of this knowledge, a lot of this information about the early grime scene, it isn't recorded as like sort of meticulously as it could be, considering the time that it was. And I think there are a lot of things that I've learned by having a very similar to Alex experience to Alex, by being like 13, 14 and being obsessed with it. So, like going on a hunt and finding out who this faceless producer or DJ is, and like, I've never seen this MC before. I'm going to go to this show. I'm going to buy a ticket. So at least I have a picture of in my mind's eye of what they look like. And then that stuff sort of breeds knowledge. And then kind of bringing I guess, to my sort of like what I feel is a sense of responsibility. There's definitely, I would say, a disconnect, or there's the potential for a disconnect between like younger appreciators or new fans of the genre who don't know about like the heritage and the culture, or don't have an in-depth kind of understanding. They know about Dizzy Rascal, they know about Wiley, but they don't know about all of the uh, smaller sort of bits and pieces that were in that. You know, borrowing one of Alex's techniques to talk about grime when it was emerging in that time. You've got a championship winning NBA franchise there, and you've got your all-stars, you've got the guys that make the team, but there were a lot of role players, and those role players held up what was going on. And without them, a lot of people like myself wouldn't have been inspired. So I feel like there's a duty of knowledge there in terms of talking about these MCs and these raves and these different experiences and parts of the culture that haven't necessarily gone on to become Wiley or become Dizzy Rascal or Kano and reach that level of success. And then also, I guess wider than that, there's even from the real short clip that Alex shared of Nole, there's always been this like intrinsic link between grime and the realities of what it's like to be a person of color, to be black, to be working class, living in a city, areas in the UK especially. And I feel like whilst it's really easy where there's success and there's money and there's bright lights and there's people becoming millionaires off of it, it's really easy to get swept up in that and talking about that. I do feel like there's a real, again, responsibility and obligation almost to continue this trend, this culture, this tradition within the genre of like sort of educating people, talking about these experiences in a way. And that's where I think some of the new vanguard of grime artists that are more prominent and have got a bigger sort of footprint, like Stormzy, for example, I think he does an excellent job of that. Really great socio-political commentary, not done in a way that is sort of like exclusive or elitist to people, or like restricting people from being understood in it, and really capturing the sentiments of his audience and his fans. And yeah, that's where I feel like the most important parts of knowledge for grime really come in, definitely in terms of the tradition and the culture, and then definitely kind of speaking to that culture that it comes from and making sure that it's not lost or sort of blended to a point where it's like lost sight of what it used to be.
Yeah, those were about 8 really good points, really important points. Yeah, I was trying to forget about the NBA because I'm a Sacramento Kings fan and we just lost in Game 7 to the Warriors, but never mind. I'll try not to get thrown off.
You put up a good fight.
Absolutely, and we haven't been in the playoffs for 16, 17 years, so it's been a long wait for me. Right. So Razor, I'm gonna, before we get into the sort of wider Q&A, maybe I'll let you have the final word with these things. I was just curious, have you read the book? Sort of at what points maybe did you sort of feed into the book? What do you think of the book? What strikes you about the book? Again, take it in any direction you want. But we now have this sort of physical thing of this, and I was just curious of any thoughts you wanted to sort of reflections on the book.
I have read the book in a fashion that I thought I was not going to read again in since I did my undergraduate. Just very, very fast skim reading, but with so much energy and enjoyment for it. And I got the PDF copy of it on my phone as well. I've actually just been reading it everywhere I go. But I do have my hardback version as well. And it's blurred out now. I don't know. We got it. But yeah, just really, really, for me, all the contributions came as just like a string of conversations. I think there was one time when Alex said, like formally, like, can we sit down and like, I'm going to record this. But then like everything else was just like a string of conversations, very much like the nature of the conversations that we have all the time. And seeing that in this format, and you know, seeing like the names and places and so many other things. Even just reading like the first like sort of bit of the first chapter, I'd actually forgotten how Alex became a member of Over the Edge. So it was like I was almost like reading it back, and because I read it the first time on the PDF version, I was like, I don't recognize this name. And then when I read it in the book with the proper like footnotes and whatnot, I was like, it's been anonymized. That's why I don't recognize this name. So I was there, but it was lovely to get that perspective. And some of those moments are, you know, they're super foundational to me and personally, but like working on represent with a lot of young people in London, hearing, you know, people say that the first time that they got inspired to do something was hearing myself and Alex do something that is priceless. And I feel like this is a really great sort of resource for them, and also a great sort of like recollection of that.
Fantastic. Yeah, yeah, the opening really sets the tone, and Alex driving people till what, 5 a.m. Driving people, which does take me back to my jazz playing days in London as well. But yeah, it was very clear that you remembered when you were asked to join the group, and your feelings about that. So yeah, that was really cool. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously lots more to say, but I'd be keen to throw it out to the wider group, because I've talked a lot. But you know, thanks both of you for your artistry and thoughts, and just like feels like the tip of a iceberg of lots of great conversations.
Thank you.
This is wonderful, you all. Thank you so much. I know that there are so many thoughts popping in all of our heads with this great conversation. So we can start off with Ginger's comment. Ginger, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, first of all, for this presentation. I was really curious because I know so little about this music form. So thanks, Alex, for this really thorough introduction. So I was kind of intrigued by this idea of like multiple MCs at once and the flow that comes from responding to colleagues, and that it could sometimes probably get combative. I think that was what you implied in your presentation. So I was curious about the recordings that you played and how like the relationship of material culture to this live scene. So how the recordings come out of the live exchange, or do they inform the live exchange, or is it a bit of both? So I'd love to hear more about that.
Cool. I'm sure Ray could definitely talk on this as well, but I'll say something short first, and I can kind of fling it across. But that's a really good question. Thank you. I think if you're speaking about the relationship between like material culture and the live, grime kind of continues in the trajectory of forms like sound system culture, where there's not this really kind of like assured linearity of production then reception, right? It's kind of everything is all happening at once, and there are multiple avenues in which ideas are tested, are reframed, refocused, and then released. So you might test out a lyric on radio, and that might get a response from someone either by texting in or tweeting. And then if that's good, then you might say, okay, that's cool. Then I'm going to fold this into a recording. And then equally, you might get recordings that do very well, and then the lyrics from that could then get folded into a live set. So that kind of that relationship is really interesting. And there are certain songs that kind of like try to recreate the live environment as well, which are kind of called 8-bar rally tunes. So it's like everyone has 8 bars. You got to try and do as much as you can, and then pass it on to the next person. So basically, that process is really interwoven, which is probably why when Ray speaks about early grime not being as well kind of like documented or memorialized, because it was quite hard to kind of in brute terms like capitalize on a product when it's some of it's so ephemeral, and sort of like some of the most important moments are like a sort of really grainy recording in a studio in Hackney that is foundational and fundamental, but that can't be turned into something that you can sell for sort of $20 in sort of Tower Records, right? So that's kind of the difficulty. But I think Ray's probably got some more stuff he can say on
Um, yeah, all really important like points, and some of the things that I hadn't actually sort of considered, Alex. But I think in terms of how it avoids becoming competitive, sometimes it does become very combative. The first time I went to Mode FM, the station that Alex now has residency on, we were there with some MCs that went on to be very famous and do very well. So Big Zoo, AJ Tracy, amongst some other artists there, and they didn't know who we were, and they didn't want to give us the microphone. And we'd all been invited by the same DJ, and there was a real sort of sense of, you know, you've got to get the microphone, and then when you've got on the microphone, one of you's got to prove your worth. And that is almost part of the improvisation element of it, because it's sort of like they're aware that people that are listening to the broadcast can only hear the broadcast, and they don't want to be associated with something that isn't at the sort of level that they're used to operating on. So they're trying to protect that element, and then you've got to come in, you've got to find all of this as it's happening live, and it's not without its sort of situations that like bubble up and become very emotional or heated, or even there are a lot of people that have said that they love grime, but they weren't able to sort of deal with the not knowing whether they were doing this right or doing that right. So it's definitely something that comes with high pressure environments. But a lot of the times where there's a mutual respect and there's a mutual understanding, even performers and artists that don't necessarily like each other are able to have that collaborative spirit in that moment, because they understand that what they're making is that final sort of like audio product for the people to enjoy or an experience in a live setting. Sure.
Does that kind of answer your question? You want to feedback on that, or yeah?
Yeah.
Oh no, I'm really enjoying hearing you talk about it, because I can, with texting and tweeting, this is like a total another level of ephemeral exchange that kind of is bubbling under the surface that then just disappears. I'm really intrigued by this kind of I don't know, I was just thinking about like the recording industry, where at least the idea is like make a recording, right? And then so many, I've spent a lot of time working on country music, and country music is basically like you do a country concert and it's about spitting back the recording, right? So the fans come to hear the recording, and I'm sure it's true for a lot of other genres. So I'm looking forward to reading the book, because I like this kind of the things that get lost in the process, and it's important that they get lost. If I'm understanding this correctly, that there's always this sense of things being metabolized and worked through, and thus also lost or discarded in the process. So thank you. I don't want to take up more of the question time, because I saw another really interesting question in the chat from Francesca.
Well, cool.
Thanks.
I'm just learning so much, and would just love to hear your thoughts on gender in grime, since that's kind of a lens that I'm often thinking about. But yeah, open to anyone who wants to comment.
If I can,
yeah, go.
If I can throw similar to Alex's initial response on the last question, bit of a more concise, but I think when, in terms of the role and representation of women, and as we move forward in time, women and non-binary people in grime, unfortunately, I feel like speaking plainly as someone who is, you know, like my parents immigrated to the UK from Nigeria, so like from West Africa. I grew up with a bunch of different other like ethnic minority people. There are a lot of issues within our own like communities when it comes to things like the patriarchy, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and art is often a mirror of these sort of experiences and these like ideas that people have. And in the same way, in the communities, there are obviously these glaring representations of, take the Black community, West African community, these glaring representations of strong, independent women who were like sort of leading their communities and being focal points of their community. These have always existed in grime. They've always existed in terms of DJs and MCs, vocal practitioners, producers. I would say they just haven't always been given the due credits and the plaudits. There were women making grime records at the time that Dizzy Rascal and Wiley were, and they were famous and they were celebrated, but they didn't reach as many eardrums or as much commercial success as those two as they did. And I would say that was probably significantly down to obviously the layers of like misogyny within the scene, unfortunately. But we are, I would say now as we enter like the 2020s, we are progressing to a point where we are seeing a lot more representation and equality. But as someone who does like DJ and MC and I'm like dabbling in events and promotion now, I say we've got a long, long way to go. And we need to sort of avoid tokenism of just like putting on one female act here, one non-binary act there. It needs to be meaningful forays into the culture. Something that I think a lot of us, something that Alex and I have spoken about hours on end. People really need to do this in a meaningful way and not just take advantage of appearing to be invested.
And there, if I could jump in, I mean, there's been some initiatives, about sort of groups of like all women gig nights or women identifying and non-binary as a safe space for I'm thinking of Girls of Grime, Ladies of Rage, Lyrically Challenged, some of these nights where we hosted a panel discussion once where they were sort of discussing the justifications for having that and the sort of stories coming out of that you had sort of male audience members saying, well, why do you need this? This is not believable, or not, and then the stories just came out. And it was really, really interesting to see and made an important case to kind of cultivate people's skills in ways that they were having difficulty to in the sort of more male dominated spaces. They were having difficulty getting to the stage, they were having difficulty not being hit on, and all these sorts of things that they were saying. So I think some of those initiatives I think have been useful in the UK as well, and we could obviously see more of it. And obviously, if the government supported the arts in any way, alongside Razor's comments about heritage and these sorts of things, would be great to have all this great stuff supported a bit more.
Great, thanks, Julius. I mean, I haven't got too much to add on that, other than to kind of reaffirm what they said regarding how grime is kind of I think is much better in terms of how it conducts itself now. And I speak with, but there's still latent issues, right? And you think things are going in the right direction, then something happens which makes you realize you're still back at step one. So I interviewed DJ Kaylee K for the book. She's an amazing DJ, works with Girls of Grime, and she speaks to how it would be great just to be known as a DJ rather than being like, no, I'm a female DJ, right? So we just book this DJ for that. And I think that's just a really fundamental and important point. And Girls of Grime have released a really good record that's just come out. And like Ray speaks to as well, they've always been really important artists within grime. So Nole was played early on, Lioness, Shiesty, all these really important figures, but they're not canonized in the same way because of sort of wider sort of like patriarchal tendencies and lenses, right? This kind of inflects upon grime in much of the way it does with other musical forms. So that's kind of something to consider. But yeah, I'm hoping things are going in the right direction. We'll always push for this and call things out. But then again, sometimes you see a lineup and you're like, wow, I don't really know how someone's put that together and thought that's okay to release. So there's still definitely a long way to go. But there have been positive steps, and I think people are now more readily calling out stuff which isn't cool and isn't right. So I'm hoping that it's moving in the right direction.
Thank you so much. That's really informative. Justin, did you want to make your suggestion or comment?
Yeah, sorry, I'm talking too much. But one thing I guess that would be interesting to talk about. And Alex in the book talks about these sort of two sites of activity, being the sort of rave, you know, and the radio set. So just an opportunity for Razor and or Alex to mention the importance of radio to this scene.
You're muted, mate.
2 years of COVID, another further year of working from home. You thought I would have learned how to work Zoom by now. Radio is everything, is what I said. Radio is it's actually difficult to sum up in a concise way because, you know, like personally, I feel like radio is where I first interacted with and fell in love with the genre, and talking to a lot of people who've had similar sort of entrances to becoming MCs, DJs, producers, invested and immersed in the scene in some way. It was very much something like that. And even now with the newer generations of fans, it's usually, if not a radio show or radio broadcasting, it's like a bit of a radio broadcast that's been clipped and put on social media. And that is their first interaction with it. And that's where they develop like this passion or this hunger to get involved. There's so much of that heritage and like culture in it as well. And then, you know, like with Rinse FM, Deja, they had like these essentially these pirate radio stations had like guys climbing up the side of tower blocks to set up their own broadcasting equipment to be able to like reach out to the community. It is so interwoven in the fabric of what grime is that all the different technological advancements and changes to radio as a broadcasting medium haven't changed its significance or its importance to it as a musical genre or a musical culture at all over the past like 20 or so years. And obviously on a more like personable level, it's again where a lot of the people who make the music forge networks and connections, inroads. It's where I met Lacey. It'll be where I personally reckon that in like 10, 15 years time, it'll be where like the next version of Lacey and myself meet each other, because people like Cabs, who we met later on, like kind of came into the crew later on from my perspective. I also met them at radio. Almost everyone in Over the Edge I met at radio, because that's where the like minds kind of came together and you really got a sense of people's vibes and stuff. And what it contributes to emerging artists and producers and DJs, especially for a scene that was, you know, like actively hounded at one point by a lot of UK police services, most famously the Metropolitan Police. There wasn't really, so we talked about having those two arenas in terms of radio and the rave. One of them got taken away, and the police were pretty like active in terms of enforcing that. And they just wanted to make sure that like grime music wasn't in any of those sort of areas, or hip hop music, dancehall music, anything that could be deemed black, to be honest. So radio really, really became the place where not only some of the stars and their talents were able to be fostered, but that sense of culture, that sense of community was fostered. And I think that goes on to this day. Alex, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that.
I think that was very comprehensive. Yeah. If anyone wants to read a bit more about that, it's in chapter 5 of the book. Kind of speaks to its kind of fundamental role. And I've got another chapter for Radio Journal that came out that does this kind of quite laborious. So there's a more interesting version is in the book, but there's a quite laborious kind of tedious thing where I went through all the radio performances over a period of time and just demonstrated how much everyone is interwoven. And it's sort of like you're never more than 2 degrees of separation away from someone. And these places become these huge hubs for creative practice. You kind of meet everyone. It's different places bump into them. And that's how those kind of networks are forged. And obviously the music itself, which happens in those spaces, is also really important too. And so the developing of creative ideas happens in situ at radio. So yeah.
Awesome. Del, your question on authenticity, are you ready to ask it?
You So yeah, my question, I guess, is, reading it from the chat here, what is your perspective on how these practices that you've identified, um, what's your perspective on how they've been reproduced or interpreted by artists in the diaspora? I'm saying this as someone who's based in Toronto, and I've seen artists here kind of doing that. So I'm just kind of intrigued from your perspective.
Do you want to go on
I
this,
would,
Rose?
I would say like generally it really goes back to what Justin was saying about knowledge for me. Um, it's always really cool to see that like people around the world are engaging in something that you would have thought like was just like local, like very like sort of hyper focused. Um, when we speak Canada, Canadian grime, immediately like, oh, it's like Trey Mission come to mind. For me, like Trey he's got family like not only in the Caribbean but also in the UK. He's been to the UK. He's kind of spent time like in South London with pioneering voices from the UK scene like Murky Ace. So I don't even think of Trey Mission as, like an international grime act, for example, an international grime MC or a Canadian grime MC. I just think of him very much in the same vein that I do a lot of the artists that are from the UK, because his authenticity speaks leaps and bounds for itself. And I think anyone can download an instrumental and rap over the top of it. And I think when people immerse themselves in the culture, that is very evident, especially to people like myself who, spent a lot of our time being invested in the culture. And I think, with Trey having all of his links, for example, or Canada and its link both linguistically and historically to like the UK, I think it's easier to sort of find that in Canada and the UK and Australia. Some of the stuff that I find really, really refreshing and encouraging is, like Japanese grime, like MCs that pack in, doing incredible things, just taking the sounds and the culture and really championing the cultural elements of practicing grime as an art form to different places where they don't necessarily understand everything from the UK like first time or second time or third time even. But it's that, again, feeling that obligation or that responsibility to do it the right way or do it in the way that it was done before, honoring that and then adding your own twist and your own innovation. I think that really shines through wherever I've seen that grime being appreciated on an international stage.
Did you want? Great, thanks, Ray. Did you want to respond? Oh, yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I just want to say thanks for the response. Appreciate it.
Lovely. Alex, did you want to add to Razor's?
Ray's kind of covered a lot of it, really. I need to kind of say that it is really interesting the way in which it moves, and kind of authenticity is a really interesting component within it. And I spent some time in East Asia last summer working with Japanese and South Korean grime artists, and I think definitely, obviously, there's a language shift there as well, but there's also about the particular way in which grime is placed and of a place, and how those artists feel they kind of try to fit into it. So there's some really sort of interesting incorporations of certain slang, for example, within that context, which feels completely dislocated from that context, right? So in Toronto, there's actually quite a lot of overlap in slang with the UK. So there's kind of, though there were certain things that you hear, say, in Canada that you also hear in the UK, but there's a bit of the way in which it moves to say East Asia is really, really interesting. But Ray's right in saying there's a really kind of fervent and huge. I mean, it's so passionate. When I was in Tokyo, like the amount of knowledge that people have of the form is remarkable, and it's really interesting how artists translate it into that context, but also how they kind of relate it to, like, well, I'm from, let's say, small village now in north of Osaka. How do I make sense of this form, and how does it relate to me? So there's really kind of interesting tensions there. And yeah, Ray mentioned as well, Australia. There's a big grime scene in Australia. Too, alongside drill. Drill is much bigger, but there's still like a kind of foundational grime scene, and also in Brazil as well. So grime in Brazil is really kind of quite popular, and there's an amazing film up there by Jesse Bernard, I think with retransfer, called Come Voce, and there's a kind of event series following on from that. So if you wanted to find out more about these sort of diasporic reinventions, I'd recommend watching that short film. It's incredible.
This is such an amazing conversation. I think we have time for Chi-Chi's last question here before we say goodbye.
Hi, yeah, I asked this back when we were talking about the live improvisation, and I'm just kind of wondering, as an American, like how this might compare to like what we would refer to as like a cipher session, and how that like might fit or not fit.
Yeah, I mean, should I go on this, Ray, or what does she think, or yeah? Or
Yeah, you go, I think. You go, I think.
Okay. So yeah, I've thought about this quite a lot. As someone who, yeah, I also obviously grew up listening to hip hop and watching sort of cipher videos and listening to ciphers and trying to find out what is distinctive. Obviously, there's lots of commonalities there. And when I interviewed, for example, Trim, who's a really incredible grime MC, and just artist more generally for this book. And when he speaks about how he's sort of developed, he's also really renowned for like clashing and kind of what would be seen as sort of like, yeah, kind of get one up in his performers in ciphers. And he's like, well, anyone who's worth their salt got involved in battle rap. And so I listened to Busta Rhymes, I listened to Eminem. These people are really foundational in seeing what I do in my practice. So I think that component is definitely within grime. But I think what happens, which maybe kind of differs, is say if you're at a cipher and there's like an instrumental which kind of goes for 6-7 minutes, right, and everyone kind of jumps over it. The tapestry kind of changes much more quickly in grime. So you could have someone over a particular instrumental, but then within 16 bars it's changed. So it's a constantly shifting basis from the DJ with the artists on top of it. So there are moments where there are ciphers and ciphers are released, but kind of what would be seen as like a set, like a grime set, would be this constantly shifting canvas of instrumental tracks with the DJ adding lots more components. So they'd use like these percussive textures like punching, which is where which also happens in hip hop as well. So like you sort of punch in a beat on the first bar and you add to it, but then it keeps changing and keeps moving. So I think it's kind of this sort of onward journey and the kind of the vectors of it, which makes it slightly different to the cipher. If
I have thought, and I have nothing to add to what Lacey just said, because my answer was going to be Lacey, the DJ. That is ultimately, for me, like I'd make hip hop music sometimes. I've rapped on hip hop beats and done ciphers. What ultimately brings the difference between a hip hop cipher and a grime set, or anything that's adjacent to a grime set, is the fact that in a hip hop cipher, I might be turning up expecting to rap on X kind of instrumental, and there might be some people whose the way that they do their things by freestyling. There might be some people who write lots of like really complicated written verses with like multi-syllabic punch rhymes and like clever bars, but like they're all sort of committing to, I guess, this vibe and going on this journey in one direction. And there's that implicit air of like not knowing what's coming next and having to think on your feet and having to have a connection with the DJ. And I think one of the best examples of it is the fact that there's something that there's a part of like sort of like grime music, garage music, dancehall sound sort of stuff, a wheel up when you like sort of start the track over again to sort of recognize the performer or the crowd's appreciation of the track. And usually conventionally when an MC gets a wheel up, the DJ will wheel the track back, start the track again, and they'll stop spitting, they'll start performing again. And one of the things that I kind of noted was like Alex always re-cued the tune in rhythm. So if he wheeled it back, it'd be like on the 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you get the 1 when you cued it again. So I just keep rapping. And that generally became a thing that we do where, the energy would reach this peak and it'd wheel up and everyone would have this expectation that it was going to dip again, but then we'd layer it up again and go with more energy. And that was kind of like, for a while, I feel like that was our little like secret sauce trick to get a bit extra out of like a crowd or a live like sort of performance from. And in a cypher, it feels like, you know, there's me, the beat, and my lyrics, and that's what there is to impress the audience with, you know what I mean? But in terms of a grime set, there's that extra performance and collaborative element. I feel that that's what distinguishes them the most.
This is so fantastic. Unfortunately, we should probably say good night to keep within our time. Let Alex go to bed. Let all of you get some rest. Thank you so much again, everyone, for joining.